So I'm delighted to welcome today's speaker. Ken Dion has been the project director for the Portlands integration at Waterfront Toronto since October 2018. Prior to moving to Waterfront Toronto, he was involved in the environmental assessment and broader planning for the Portlands project since 2002. Through his time with the Toronto Regional Conservation Authority, Ken has managed several complex environmental assessments, including the Lakeview Waterfront Connection Project in Mississauga, the Don Mouth Naturalization and Portlands Flood Protection Project, Downtown Brampton Flood Protection Project, Broadview Eastern Flood Protection Project, and the Lower Don River West Remedial Flood Protection Project. Currently, Ken is involved with real estate and asset transactions for Portland's project, environmental compliance and reporting, facilitating coordination between various Portland's project elements. He's also involved in other capital projects in the broader Central Toronto area and Indigenous engagement and collaboration with Waterfront Toronto initiatives. And with that, I will hand the reins off to Ken.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to present about the Portland's Flood Protection Project today. I will just share my screen. Is that showing? Oops, wrong one, sorry.
I see your Outlook window.
Yeah.
There we go.
Okay, thank you. All right, thank you very much. I'll jump right into it. So before we get into what we're doing, I'm going to do a brief summary of why we're here in the first place. To give a little context for those who may or may not be familiar with the Portlands project and where it is, as you can see on the map on the right of the screen, it is at the mouth of the Don watershed as it enters into the Keating Channel before flowing into the Toronto Inner Harbour. The Don watershed has 7 larger sub-watersheds, total area covering about 36,000 hectares. And it flows about 38 kilometers from the Oak Ridges Moraine. It is one of Canada's most urbanized and impacted watersheds, with about 85% urban land uses, with about 14% natural cover, the majority of that located within the ravine system, but also some green spaces identified locally in the headwaters itself, with a little bit of rural lands left in the Oak Ridges Moraine area. And as such, the watershed has a very distinctive urban hydrology where any sorts of rainfall will immediately be routed through the typical hardened surfaces and stormwater systems into the River Valley corridor. But it wasn't always like this, of course. So this is a map going back to 1793, just as the incoming governor Simcoe was coming in to take over this part of Upper Canada, and identified that the future capital for the area should be relocated from close to the border, Niagara region, over into the Toronto Bay area. The peninsula and the bay provide a very good defensive position in the case of future American aggression at the time. The Don River at the time was very similar sort of features you would find in other watersheds draining into Lake Ontario within the broader Toronto area. It's a deep and sized ravine, a highly meandering channel. The big difference between this river and other rivers in the area is the large sediment loads that would come downstream with the Don actually met with extremely large volumes of sediment that was flowing along the longshore as a result of erosion from the Scarborough Bluffs at the time. So we have this large volumes of sediment meeting from 2 different sources, creating a long spit and barrier beach system that established what became one of the larger coastal wetlands on Lake Ontario at the time, which was Ashbridges Bay Coastal Wetland. But as population growth occurred, and particularly in the 1900s, when the Toronto Harbor Commissioners were established to accelerate industrial land develop, as well as provide sort of a focus for maximizing shipping tied in with railway expansion in the area, there was an extensive amount of lake filling that occurred. And this basically shows pretty much everything south of Queen Street becoming lake-filled area. What was the Ashbridges Bay became the Portlands, and what was originally a spit became cut off by the Eastern Gap in the mid-1800s, which became the Toronto Islands, of course. Oops. So this is a photo, the earliest activities from the newly formed harbor commissioners back in 1912 as they were establishing what became the Keating Channel so that they can divert the mouth of the Don River into the Keating Channel, which would turn the river 90 degrees into the inner harbor. You can see to the right the remnants of what used to be a very lush and extensive coastal marsh in Ashbridges Bay. And there really wasn't much left at that point that would be considered naturalized habitat. As a result of all this land creation, we've basically established an area that was very low lying. Portions of the river immediately upstream around Queen Street or so, that where the original ravine conditions ended and the original shoreline conditions started. You can see that there is no way to convey large volumes under very large flood events within the constructed river valley system. And as such, water would spill over the banks north of the railway bridge crossing going into Union Station and flowing through the Eastern Avenue underpass. And as well as flooding would spill through the former Unilever lands, the now Cadillac Fairview development sites, and across what is the Portlands and South Riverdale area. As a result of all this work, of course, the habitat conditions, as you're very aware, are poor. The vertical concrete dock walls do not provide a lot of riparian habitat or function. The channel itself doesn't provide a lot of physical structure or habitat within the water column. There is a lack of submergent and riparian vegetation with quite a bit of turbidity. Water quality is impaired, particularly in the summer, given low summer oxygen concentration and periodic algae blooms. And of course, this all contributes to relatively poor fish, bird, and wildlife and insect communities, which is the foundation of the food web in this area. On top of that, once the lands were created by the harbor commissioners in the early 1900s, industry came in with a vengeance. As you can see, this image from the 70s, there's extensive oil tanks, refineries, and storage that were established across the Portlands. And as a result of that, there is a significant legacy of those activities where large volumes of the oil and crude and gasoline ended up in the soils and the groundwater surrounding the area. As well as there's also a wide suite of other industrial activities such as foundries, munitions manufacturing, waste transfers, cattle rending plants. So there really was a large suite of activities. And of course, the environmental records those days were very poor, shoddy, and pretty much the activities that were occurring within the buildings, a lot of the byproducts ended up in the groundwater and the soils. And on top of that, the sediment that was always being discharged by the Don River, which helped form the barrier beaches in the first place, continues to come downstream from the Don. We do receive about 30 to 40,000 cubic meters of sediment into the Keating Channel every year, which does have to be dredged and taken over to the confinement cells that have been constructed in the mid-80s at Tommy Thompson Park. And we also have a lot of urban waste that floats downstream. and has to be removed in the hundreds to thousands of tons of garbage every year as part of the operations to ensure that we reduce the waste getting into the lakes and out into the ocean through the St. Lawrence, but also avoid impacts to navigation within the inner harbor and the fouling of propellers and smaller vessels. So there's a whole history on how we got to this point. So I'm going to jump into that. We did get to this point where we have a solution to address a lot of those issues I just walked through. So the Portland's Flood Protection Project is the synthesis of two environmental assessments that were undertaken and completed in 2015. The first environmental assessment was the Don Mouth Naturalization Flood Protection Project, which was led by the Toronto Region Conservation Authority with partnership with the Waterfront Toronto and the city. And in parallel to that, there was the Lower Don Lands Master Plan Class EA, which was led by Waterfront Toronto in partnership with the city. The first one identified how can we provide flood protection for the Don River while naturalizing the Don River. If we just wanted flood protection, this would be a very different project, while at the same time providing opportunities to allow existing land uses to occur in the area and to facilitate the future development of sustainable communities around the river once completed. The Lower Don Lands Master Plan followed the Don Mouth and identified how do we create the municipal infrastructure based on where the river was going to be. So in most cases in Ontario, it's, developers will come into a parcel of land, identify how much housing they want to get on it. And if there's a river or a natural feature that has to be accommodated, they try to maximize the value of the land while doing what needs to be done on a regulatory perspective with the natural feature. We kind of turned that process around here where we identified the needs of the naturalized system that we wanted to get to and the flood protection foremost, and then we fit the developments in the lands that were created as a result. In this case, as you can see, we created two islands. Villiers Island is the northern island and the southern one is South River Precinct. And so you can see with the creation of the Three River Valley system, we have a need for new road alignments in the area that ties in with new bridges and considerations for servicing. And we also have sort of a mandate for creating an establishment of an entirely publicly accessible water's edge that is in this area. Where are we at as of September? We are very close to what the concept looks like. As you can see, we've mostly constructed the river at this point. The vegetation is looking spectacular in some spots. You can't tell that the vegetation that's been established is only 2 years old. We have all our bridges completed except for the new Lakeshore Bridge where the Don River meets with the Keating Channel. We have a series of parks, Promontory Park South in the Inner Harbor, as well as two parks on either side of the east-west portion of the Naturalized Channel. Those are underway. And we have a series of roads that have been completed and open to the public already, and since January, providing the public with really good vantages of our progress over the last 8 months or so. Where do we want to go with this over the next 20 years or so is a fully developed sustainable communities on the various islands, as well as north of the Keating Channel and further east of the river itself, with relocated Gardner and Lakeshore, so we can maximize public access to water's edge in the Keating Channel on the north side, as well as the south side of the Keating Channel. So how did we get there? Do we just start drawing things up? Actually, the EA itself looked at a very wide range of options to provide the triple objectives of flood protection, naturalization, and integration with the city. We ultimately ended up with a solution that kept the Keating Channel, principally because it's wide and deep and is able to allow us to move extremely large volumes of water under large flood events under a very stable condition. It also provides, the vast majority of time when you don't have a very large flood going through, a great place to provide dockside cafes and promenades and other experiences for the public, which is sort of an experience that is somewhat limited in the Toronto area. So, in addition to a modified Keating Channel, we created two new valley systems through a combination of cutting into the existing soil to lower the bed elevation, but also to raise the land on either side of the new river valley to provide the flood protection. And within that area, we created a very naturalized habitat conditions that supplements not only the ability to provide the flood protection, but also provides great green spaces, but a lot of passive recreational opportunities and appreciation of the species and wildlife that will be coming to the area. How did we know how much space we required? Well, we know we have to pass a Hurricane Hazel-sized flood event. That is well larger than a 1 in 500, 1 in 750 event. It's not really given a rating curve value because it is so unprecedented. And so it is a very large volume. And on top of that, we provide an extra half meter of valley height to deal with potentially larger floods in the future than Hurricane Hazel to address climate change and uncertainty. So we undertook two-dimensional hydraulic digital modeling, to up to our Hurricane Hazel size flood event. And basically we did digitize the entire proposed river mouth and its conditions and all the infrastructure that would potentially have an impact on the movement of water through the area until we were able to confirm that the river valley dimensions were able to pass the floodwaters into the inner harbor, and we have no residual spill going into the adjacent urban lands. And then we raised the ground even higher to deal with that climate change consideration. And how we established what the river looks like, well, we looked at other rivers in the area. So we went over to Scarborough and we looked at the Rouge Marshes. We also went over to Ajax and looked at the Duffins, and we even looked at the old maps from the Don River where before it got into Ashbridges Bay, what the channel form looks like. And we consistently see a highly meandering river system. And as you got closer to the lake, there was back lagoon wetlands with a mixture of submergent and emergent and marshes, as well as meadow marsh. And that was closely related to well-defined elevations in relation to the average Lake Ontario water levels conditions. And we mimicked and replicated those meander form shapes and the function of those off-channel wetland habitats to come up with the features that we have. And so based on that, we were able to provide a wide suite of different elevations within the wide valley system that we had, targeting the different habitat communities based on its elevation comparison to Lake Ontario. And that really is the driver. That typical condition drives what the vegetation, a stable vegetation communities will look like in the long term. And of course, we're building something new that isn't there anymore. We haven't had wetland in this area since the early 1900s, and we wanted more than just plants to provide habitat for wildlife and fisheries. And of course, with a very juvenile young marsh system, we don't have a lot of old growth vegetation that's fallen over and it's already decaying or providing opportunities for bird holes to be established in standing deadwood. So we created, as part of the work, artificial habitat elements to attract more than just the fish. We want to bring in a suite of different types of birds and wildlife for both reptiles and other species in the area, so that we have a really wide palette of different types of fish and wildlife to come to the area that we're trying to build. And even before we're completed, we've already been seeing huge increases in recruitments of fish communities in the area as well. So as part of our operations, we continue to partner with TRCA, and they do a lot of monitoring for us, and will continue to do a lot of monitoring in the area as the river is establishing during the construction phase and post-construction. And we're already seeing all sorts of large recruitments of such species as the pumpkin seed, walleye are coming in, pike are coming in, bluegill, largemouth. We have endangered American eel that's been found here. And we had the first sighting of a bowfin this spring in the Don watershed since the taking of records in there. And the bowfin is a really neat fish too. For those who don't know what a bowfin is, this is actually in our brand new river channel itself. This is the male bowfin guarding his nest that the female had left behind, the eggs, and to the top still are some unhatched eggs. To the bottom, you can see the darker masses. That's actually young of the year that just hatched from their eggs. So that was a really exciting site to find in our new river system on year one after being opened up to the lake just a couple of months earlier. So back in June, this gives you a fairly good idea of what the habitats, the meandering looking to the east, the new Commissioner Street Bridge, the river kind of winding towards us. You can see the back channel wetlands that are established. They're much greener now than in June. We have connections, public connections that will be connecting to a levee side trail system and pedestrian bridges. And the foreground at the bottom part of the image, that's a carp gate, and that's attached to all our back channel wetlands. That allows the public to walk across the opening to the wetland, but inside we have basically it's a fish jail. It'll have vertical bars very closely spaced together. That is actually will allow the majority of native fish to be able to pass through with a little bit of shimmying to get inside the wetlands to be able to reproduce and use the wetlands. But because they are fairly close together, the adult carp, which are very bulbous, won't be able to access through those gates and rip up the submergent and emergent vegetation that's in the process of establishing in the wetlands right now. So it's a passive way, a very effective way to selectively allow certain species, this desired native species, to come into the wetlands and use the constructed habitat while keeping out the more destructive introduced species such as carp. But that's all the top dressing. There was probably a third of the costs of our project was below the ground and in the groundwater table. The legacy of contamination in the soils that we had to deal with. We don't want to just dig into the ground and release, as you can see on the left-hand side, large volumes of oil just directly into our brand new constructed wetlands. So we had to deal with that. That was a really important component of the work, is how do we construct the river valley and then ensure that we cannot have these nasty stuff from the soils leaching into our newly created habitats. So the first thing we had to do is, we're at Lake Ontario water level here. The ground is only about 2 meters, 1.5 to 2 meters above the typical lake level condition. And that means the groundwater table was about 1.5 meters below the surface of the ground. And we needed to go down about 9 meters deep to excavate the valley to deal with the contamination. So the first thing we had to do is install a series of cutoff walls surrounding the entire future valley system. These cutoff walls are a combination of different types. Some of them were concrete caissons that go down to bedrock. Bedrock ranges from 9 meters down to 55 meters. There's unfortunately an old 350 million year old bedrock valley system here, which cut through the area, which unfortunately create a significant extra cost to be able to do these walls. But we had to create these concrete walls so that we can isolate the excavation area from the adjacent groundwater table. So once we had isolated where we were going to excavate the valley system, we had a single pump that allowed us to dewater the area within it without having Lake Ontario pour into our excavation, and that allowed us to do the excavation work in the dry. There is other sections where we didn't need to go quite so hard. We used slurry walls, which was a bentonite cement type of mixture, which was easier to build. But the secant pile walls were critical to allowing us to be able to do the construction that was required. So this gives you an idea of what some of these type of cutoff walls, these are the secant pile walls. They're about 1.25 meters in diameter to each, ranging in depth from 9 to 55 meters deep. And every second one has a large steel beam driven down the middle of it so that the concrete was both watertight as well as self-reinforced. We didn't have to put in anchors or tiebacks to keep the dock walls up. They were holding themselves up and keeping the adjacent contaminated soils and groundwater out of our excavation. We had the slurry walls, which were somewhat easier to build. And for one location, right where the new Cherry Street South Bridge was constructed, we put in, basically it's a dam. It's about a 6-foot diameter, a thick concrete steel reinforced wall down to bedrock. And the reason for that difference is as part of the construction phasing, we needed to have a structure that would keep the contaminated soils that we're managing from falling into the lake and where the Lafarge ships come in pulse and slip. And later on, when we started excavating the river on the other side of this wall, it kept Lake Ontario from falling into the excavation. So it's a unique structure, again, self-reinforced, that was able to withstand weight of water and land in two separate directions, depending on the phase of the project. So where are we at now? We're currently removing that wall. Removal started this spring. We should have it completely removed this fall. This is right below the southern bridge for Cherry Street, just before you get to the docks and the ship channel, the lift bridge at the ship channel. And this involves diving and heavy equipment and breaking that thick reinforced concrete in small sections so that the excavator could lift it out of the water. We are also in the process of removing the secant pile that separates our new river valley system with the Keating Channel. Most of it has been removed, and it will be entirely removed by the end of this month. But hydraulically, the river has already been connected. The Don River has already been connected to our new naturalized channel. And in fact, the July 16th storm we had, the 100-year flood, we already had a portion of this removed. So we did have significant percentage of the flows from that storm going into our new naturalized river valley system. But of course, when we dug down about 8-9 meters going back to our cutoff walls, we still didn't remove all the contaminated soil that was underneath our feature river valley. Some of the soils were actually quite clean and didn't require much other than just putting in a thick layer of clean soil on top of it. Other areas was quite contaminated still. And so we actually had to deal with the installation of variable types of remediation layers, depending on the types and concentration of the remaining underlying contaminants. And in some cases, it really begins to look like a birthday cake of different types of treatments, different types of technologies to ensure that we don't have upwellings of contaminated groundwater coming up through into our nicely clean naturalized river system at the end of the day. And as you can see, even though we dug down about 8-9 meters, we filled most of the hole up afterwards with the clean layers and remedial layers in order to create the elevations necessary to have a ecologically functioning river and wetlands within the valley system. The cutoff walls that we built remain in place. They will disappear with all the fill that we're building back up. Not only were those cutoff walls required for the construction phasing, but they are instrumental in keeping contaminated groundwater outside of the valley from flowing into the river valley after we're done. So it was a very expensive piece of work that allowed us to do the construction, but has a long-term important role for the long-term longevity of our clean habitat conditions that we've built. And in some areas, the soils were extremely clean. We were surprisingly clean, and this is mainly actually close to the inner harbor itself, in the Canoe Cove area, which I'll show in a little bit, where we actually were able to just excavate it and place it into the park afterwards with very little extra consideration. So there was some areas that that was was possible and was well received. And you can see this area where I'm referring to. This is what it used to look like on the left in 2019, the old marine dock walls and operations. And as you can see from this June, we've removed the dock walls. We create a more undulating armor stone shoreline with vegetated islands. And there's a nice beach in behind the islands where people will be able to rent kayaks and canoes and come out on the beach and go and do a 3.3-kilometer tour around the Villiers Island that's been constructed up the river, down the Keating Channel, and back to the Canoe Cove area. Of course, we still have sediment, and that's never going to go away. And as part of the flood protection solution, this is north of Lakeshore, just before the river enters into the Keating Channel. To be able to provide flood protection, we had to widen and deepen the river north of Lakeshore. We had to raise the bridge, lengthen the bridge, and lower the ground underneath the bridge as well, so that we can get those large floodwaters underneath Lakeshore, and so that it could be split into the Keating Channel and the New Naturalized River. The problem is we have a lot of sediment in that water, and when you lower and widen the river in a location, that's the area where sediment's going to fall out of the water. So instead of managing sediment like we've been doing for the last 100 years in the Keating Channel, that sediment management now has to occur north of Lakeshore. So that requires new equipment, new operations, and that will be starting its operation next spring as the city, TRCA, and Ports Toronto work together to start the new sediment management operations in that area. And as you can see, the area north of Lakeshore and under the Lakeshore and portions of the Keating Channel, particularly in the East End, will continue to be actively dredged going into the future. Indigenous engagement has been critical for this program. We've been working with First Nations communities all the way back to the early 2000s with the environmental assessment startup. And then as we got into detailed design and construction, we greatly expanded our engagement program. We've been working closely with Mississauga's the Credit First Nation for many, many years. And as part of the process of our engagement, they were the ones that recommended we needed to have a deeper investment of cultural inputs and ideas in our designs for the public realm and interpretation for this wetland that is being established. So, so as part of that process, we started off with a request for proposals to hire an Indigenous engagement facilitator. We selected a firm called Minokamic, led by Elder Shelley Charles. And we worked closely with Minokamic to expand meaningful engagement program, not only with the Mississaugas of Credit, who are partners at the table, but with a wide range of other First Nations with traditional ties to the land, as well as the urban Indigenous communities. And as part of that, we were able to greatly enhance our design, which I'll give you some inputs there. And of course, as through this process, we've been doing quite a bit of effort trying to meet a lot of the targets established in the City of Toronto's own Reconciliation Action Plan. So as we were moving forward, we had facilitated detailed workshops led by Minokamic and Mississaugas of Credit with various First Nations communities. We received all sorts of great information from them. We did an in-depth analysis with Mississaugas of Credit and Minokamic and tried to develop some big overlapping themes between the various communities and to try to allow an opportunity for inclusion within the overall public realm. And these themes included, there was huge cultural attachments with regards to water, unsurprisingly, as well as animals and fish. There was also a lot of importance to educate and recognize that both settlers as well as the First Nations, we are all treaty people. And as such, we need to have an opportunity to identify within the park an opportunity to educate and inform the public who use that park that of the past councils and the treaty histories that they are parties to. There was also a lot of interest in celebrating the 13 moons and the seasons, as well as the four directions teachings. And of course, we also wanted to expose and educate signage that included Ojibwe language. And through these sort of themes, we had a lot of input in the indigenous plantings that we've incorporated to ensure that important species are included within our palette of the wetlands and the upland forests. One exciting thing that we had is while we're doing excavations a few years ago, we started in one spot near where the new Commissioner Street Bridge was going to be constructed. And we stopped excavating there for a few months and went somewhere else. And we had stopped just within the original peat lands from the original wetland. And over those few months, the seeds that had lain dormant for 120 years and surrounded by lands that had been heavily industrialized and contaminants, those seeds germinated and created a large extensive area of river bulrush and cattails and other species. And one day we were sitting in our office and the contractors called us in September saying something's growing on site and you need to get down here. And we came down and sure enough, we had all these plants that started not only to germinate from that old seed bank, but they actually also had new seeds and were producing the next generation of plants right away as well. So we worked with TRCA. We collected all of the plants, relocated most of them at Tommy Thompson Park in the wetlands there. We collected a lot of peat as well. And the University of Toronto conducted extensive surveys of the seeds and the pollen in the soils and tried to germinate more plants in their nursery. And we had soil and vegetation repatriation ceremonies on site with Mississaugas and Minokamik and incorporated all of the wetlands with about 20 centimeters of this original wetland peat in the area. So a lot of the plants that are in the wetlands, even though we put in a lot of plants, a lot of the plants that are now growing in the wetlands already are from those older seed sources bound from the peat. Another component of we have directional compass marker trees. So it was a way First Nations often marked trails in the past and manipulated the shape and form of young saplings and guided them as they matured to basically provide a compass direction on where people need to go to get to point A to point B. And we're going to try to replicate that in locations within the park. And we have teaching signifiers, Indigenous art, as well as dotem animals that will be part of our formal parks play areas. We have interpretive signage in multiple languages. We have Indigenous sculptures that are going to be incorporated in the new Lakeshore Bridge. We have a new fire holder feature, Indigenous design, as well as ceremony and celebration structures as well. And these are located throughout the future river mouth. In addition to the Indigenous design elements, we have, of course, a lot of play areas in the parks. So we have active children's wilderness play areas being established. We have event lawn spaces. We have canoe places. We have promontories. We have formal dock wall overlooking the inner harbor. That's going to be established. Dog off leash areas. We also have kept the old fire hall that has been picked up and moved 25 meters into the park and will become part of the public washrooms and event spaces for the Toronto Parks Department. And so there's quite the suite of passive and recreational activities established in the adjoining areas from the river. Within the river, we have a full visioning program for future water taxis, fishing, nature interpretation, kayak ingress and egress, bird watching, overlooks. So there really is a great suite for nature interpretation and interactions with the environment. And of course, trails. We're creating a new 1 kilometer long river channel system. We have about 6 kilometers of different types of trails feeding through the area at different elevations with different types of surfacing. Some are higher velocity bike routes. Other ones are much more intimate and rustic to allow people to really appreciate what they're walking along. And of course, that ties in with a more regional network of bike trails as well, connecting to Lakeshore and beyond. Some of the heritage features in the area, we're keeping the Atlas crane that has been a landmark along the shoreline for decades. The shoreline had to be reinforced around it so that it remains stable. By the time we open the park up that it's within, the rust will be gone. We'll have painted it all white, and it will become a major destination feature within the Promontory Park South. As I mentioned earlier, we kept the fire hall and we had to relocate that to get out of the way of the future bus lane along Commissioners, and that has become a major feature within the park. We have all sorts of wilderness play areas. This emulates the Cheltenham Badlands up in the Caledon region, the clays, the banded clays, and of course we've also added a water play feature in this, so kids will be able to run up and down the slopes and splash in the water and play amongst the wood features. We have different types of artistic play structures where kids can climb inside, and the big snowy owl. We have a big raccoon and other play structures. And this gives you a little more idea of the new shoreline where the Atlas crane is located. And this is raising the grades in the Promontory Park South. So we have we did a lot of viewscape analysis, and we have all sorts of programming packed within this future Promontory Park South based on topographic variation and follow trails that are relatively short viewscapes opening up into grand vistas. So it really is just walking on a trail is really going to be quite the exploration. And we have reinforced all of the dock walls of that park that overlooks the inner harbor. And we'll be putting a grand promenade in here. So it'll be a really great event space, right, with spectacular views of the Toronto Islands and the Toronto Inner Harbor. And of course, we have the big bridges. These are a family of bridges that went through a design competition and were selected. They have very unique arches. These were mostly constructed in Nova Scotia and shipped up the seaway on barges by tug and brought into their locations. We have these are the two bridges that are for the new Cherry Street alignment over the Keating Channel. The wider one is open to the public as a vehicle bridge. The smaller, narrower one will be the future bus bridge with a long-term vision of LRT, light rapid transit. You'll note that this bridge is red. Further south, we have a longer bridge. This one is yellow. This one will be connecting toward over the new naturalized river mouth. And then we have the longest span, which involves two separate bridge sections, which is orange color for the Commissioner Street Bridge. These have basically we've built in one directional traffic in each way for all the bridges, and a very large bike trail as well as pedestrian sidewalks with cantilevered overlooks so people can stop on the bridge and look out off the bridge into the river and have different experiences just from the public right of way. And the last slide I have is where are we at in the project. So as I mentioned earlier, we're in the process of finalizing the connection of the main river with the new naturalized channel, which will be done this fall, possibly early winter 2025. The flood protection should be achieved early in 2025 at this point. The River Park North and South will be completed later this winter, but won't be opened until the Promontory Park South is completed. And we hope to have a grand opening later next summer of all the river and the park components together. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thanks, Ken.
My pleasure.
So we got one question already. Were you dealing with mostly sand or clay?
In the excavation, I assume?
Yeah.
We had a combination of sand and peat and garbage and concrete and fill. The Portlands were constructed in the wetlands, so we have an underlying wetland peat layers, but then in creating the land, the Port Harbor Commissioner used a combination of sand dredging to bury the old wetland, as well as when a building was going to be torn down and a new one put in place, they basically knocked down that building and everything in it and just threw it in the lake. So we found all sorts of interesting artifacts and paraphernalia from late 1800s, early 1900s as we were digging through that top layer of fill.
Okay. Are there any other cities or countries looking at a similar project that you're aware of?
There is a lot of places. A lot of places have precedents that we borrowed from. The Netherlands had Room for the River that they started about a decade before us, and they have a lot of the same sort of approaches for creating a river that we used. Of course, it was at many sites over hundreds of kilometers of river. We kind of put them all into one single section of river and added to city and complex brown soil condition, and so it really added to the complexity to it, being have it all located in one project site. We do know there is a lot of projects around that are taking aspects of what we do. And so it does provide a great lessons learned for working in brownfields or flood protection, or we use a whole suite of different techniques to putting in installation of servicing and coordinating with third-party utilities. So the complexity of itself is pretty unique. Very few places in the world have this level of complexity for this type of work. But there is something that a lot of projects that can be borrowed as part of their learning and inclusion in their own planning.
Alrighty. You had a picture of some yellow flowers in one of your slides. I guess they wanted to know what those flowers were.
I couldn't tell you, unfortunately.
Okay.
I'm not the
You're not the naturalist.
No.
Any botanists in the group that can address?
Yeah, we'll have to look. What level of concern about ongoing erosion of the New River path in storm situations?
I think we're pretty good. As part of the work that we've done, the most important thing for this design is that we don't want to have the massive storms cause valley erosion that would put communities at risk. And we also didn't want to armor the wetlands to the point that we can't actually use green spaces. We did want to have a softer approach. So basically what we did is we hid all of the heavy duty armoring to make sure that the islands stay in place and all the critical infrastructure stays in place. But we acknowledge that as you get into flood events in the 1 in 350 year event, 1 in 500 year event, we're going to be seeing damage on the trails. We're going to be seeing damage in the wetlands that the city and TRCA will have to go in and clean up afterwards. The important thing, though, is to make sure that there's no pathways under any size flood event, that it will rip through the layers that are keeping the contamination separate from the naturalized system, preventing that from coming back in and making sure that the communities that are going to be constructed in the future remain safe.
Okay. Do you know when the opening will be announced for the parks? I'm guessing.
That is a sliding scale. So as soon as we are substantially ready with the construction completion, we'll be, and we're confident on that date of construction completion, we'll be making announcements. But right now we're looking at late summer next year.
Okay. Will the viewing site be permanent? I don't know what
The-
viewing.
I'm assuming the question refers to the viewing tower we have
Oh,
at
yeah, yeah.
Commissioners and New Cherry Street. No, that will be taken out.
And follow-up question from the same person. When you cross the new pedestrian bridge from Parliament Street slip, what will be there? Wetlands?
Right now there's wetlands that are located. So from this image here, I'm still showing the images, right?
Yeah.
So if you can see my arrow, we have a wetland. This is our first wetland that was constructed back in 2019. That's just full of largemouth bass and all sorts of other species. So that's fully functioning as part of that initial work. In this area here, it is more of a sandy embankment. So that's more open to flows from the river and the lake. That will be transformed into a canoe put in as well. When that pedestrian bridge is first done, it's mainly going to be a thoroughfare with a pedestrian trail to connect to the Promontory Park South as well as over to Cherry Street. In the long-term visioning, additional works to expand that park to the north surrounding that trail will occur. So it's going to be a work in progress over a period of years.
Okay. Are you aware of when the vehicle entrance to the Gardner heading west will be done?
Vehicle entrance going to the Gardner to the west. I'm not sure the exact date of that. I'm sorry.
Yeah, okay. How many levels of government were involved or had input into the project?
Well, all three levels of government are funding this project, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3.
Okay.
We also have them on our, we report to all three levels of government regularly on our project progress, identification of risks, schedule, cost issues, technical challenges. We've had some unique issues trying to implement a project this scale, and we've had to actually pull in senior representatives of all three levels of government to assist us at times to help us deal with issues that were beyond the ability of Waterfront Toronto to handle on our own. So this collaboration and partnership and funding and regular reporting back to has been core and central to the overall program.
Okay. So someone once saw a digital simulation of the flood coverage after Hurricane Hazel type event. They think it showed flooding extended up to Queen Street in Leslieville. Are some old Toronto neighborhoods now better protected from storm damage than they formerly were, or has this project mostly enabled future development of the new precincts?
So that old modeling, that's a good memory. That's going back quite a few years, so that's impressive. That old modeling showed that we had eliminated all the flooding into the east and to the south and the Keating Channel precinct. That earlier flooding showed a smaller amount north of the railway corridor east of the river. It didn't go all the way to Queen Street like it shows here, but it did go through Eastern Avenue. And the reason for that is at the time of the EA, most of this land is in private ownership, and we were not able to reasonably expand into that site. Subsequent planning, working with the City of Toronto in the mid-2010s, around 2015, we started a separate environmental assessment with TRCA and the city, and came up with a solution that will eliminate essentially all the flooding on the north side of the railway corridor as well. So that last 8 hectares of land that was shown in that old hydraulic model to the east is also going to be eliminated with the over the next few years. That should be completed around 2028, and that's currently at just about 90% design, and we hope to start construction of that next year, 2026.
All righty. When will housing development start?
There is housing going on along the waterfront already, to the east and quayside. We're continuing to move east from quayside onward. The Villiers Island hopefully starts the design process for individual blocks within the area in the coming year or so, and we probably see development proceeding not too far after the flood protection is in place.
And do you have a sense of like the mixture of housing, rental, condos?
I can't speak to the details of that. I do know I believe the most recent number is 30% affordable housing, but
Right.
I can't
Okay.
100% confirm that, but I think it's 30%.
Will there be a management plan to monitor and control invasive plant species in the river valley?
Very good question. Once we are completed the river, we are going to be passing that river ownership on to the City of Toronto, who has an agreement with the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority, who will maintain the river valley on their behalf. There will be some level of involvement. They will not have, I don't think they'll have the invasive resources to do an exhaustive invasive species management. And there might be opportunities working with future community groups to help out through stewardship opportunities to help out with that process. But that's still, the details of that are still in the discussions.
All right. What are the best practices coming out of engagement with the public and Indigenous communities involved?
Well, that's a whole different presentation. That
Yeah. We'll bring you back.
For one thing, we wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for the engagement program. I think it's safe to say. This project was only ever possible because the public demanded it, going way back to the 1980s. 1989, large number of the public held a large meeting at the Ontario Science Centre, and there was 400 or 500 people that showed up, and the city officials of the day were in attendance. The Conservation Authority was in attendance. Other agency staff were in attendance. And demands that the government do something about the Don watershed as an entirety, were to no longer treat it as a sewer, to try to improve the conditions and the recreational opportunities throughout the entire watershed. It was a lot of anger. And so a few months later, the City of Toronto established a citizen-led task force called Task Force to Bring Back the Don. And they undertook a 2-year study to come up with recommendations for government to improve habitat from the top to the bottom of the watershed. And of course, one of the recommendations is bring back the mouth of the Don River. And in 1991, that report was released. A couple months later, there was a parallel study underway by the federal government. It was a Royal Commission on the Future of the Toronto Waterfront, and that included everything from Mississauga over to Scarborough. And they had a report in 92 that identified a whole suite of things to improve the conditions for public use and access environments on the waterfront. And of course, they dovetailed with the task force resolutions at the mouth of the Don to naturalize and flood protect. And that formed the basis of all the planning that occurred in the early 2000s, where the task force, the Toronto Waterfront tied with the Olympic bid in 2008. That didn't occur, but at least the recommendations continued, where we would create a Waterfront Toronto agency to lead the revitalization, cleanup, flood protection, sustainable development, public park space. All of that came out from those early workshops and reports from the 90s. And formed the basis of Waterfront Toronto to move forward. The City of Toronto in 2003 set up built this all into their official plan with the secondary plan amendment process. And from that, we started an environmental assessment that involved not just doing your typical open house. You should have some boards, some consultants around boards, and you just get some discussion and check marks and off you go. We had science centers developed to talk with each individual issue associated with the challenges and opportunities. We held public walks on the weekends where we had 8 stations located throughout the Portlands, including a boat cruise. So the public can talk to each of the different specialists and get a real big flavor, not only of the issue, but the size of the space. That this area is so big, these maps just don't give you any sense of just how big an area is. So we wanted to give people to see just the magnitude of the challenges we're facing by giving the spatial constraints of these issues on the ground. And by the end of our environmental assessment, when we were doing our last public meeting, we had like 500 people show up to our public meeting. Usually when you do an EA with 500 members of the public showing up, they're there to, you need police escorts to get in and out safely. It's usually not a good news story when you have that many people show up. And I kid you not, every time someone's paused for a few seconds to get a breath and as part of the presentation, people would start applauding. It was just so much excitement. And really, it was that core and an energy that allowed us to go through changes of government, different ideas, the Portlands in the early 2010-11, and allowed this concept to continue to be the preferred approach to dealing with the Portlands and flood protection, naturalization, city building, working with communities. And it really is sort of a testament of all the collaboration. I wouldn't even say it's public engagement. It was collaborating with members of the public all the way through, before there was a project even, all the way through the process to ensure that we can get to where we are today.
Thank you very much. We've run out of time, so I'm going to stop there.